Okay, welcome to Into the Channel podcast, primarily about women's football. Before we hit the pitch, if you enjoy the show or love women's football as much as your boys do, well, as much as we all do, I'll say, come kick it with us already. We are doing this every single week, spanning the wide world of women's football. We're spanning pretty wide this week. I mean, I don't think we can get... I think this is maximum span that we've got going on this week, so we're very excited. Subscribe, follow YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you like to watch or listen at ITC_pod on X. All of our socials in the show notes of this episode. I'm your host, Dino De Cespedes, and as always, I am joined by my co-host, Mr. Grant Engel. What is up, man?
I'm feeling fantastic, buddy, and I'm feeling fantastic in part because I have the distinct pleasure of introducing our guest for today's show. Our guest is a digital sports journalist, a writer, a podcaster, and a mentor to young people in Australia. She is a pioneer in the women's football media space. She started covering MacArthur Rams Football Club matches at Linwood Park, from my calculations roughly 40-ish kilometers outside of Sydney, before there was any media coverage for that club, and then followed the Matildas to France for the 2019 World Cup to cover the squad for her blog, A View from the Cheap Seats. Now, their work can be found at the Australian Broadcasting Company, in The Guardian, ESPN, Optus Sports. She's also the co-host of the Far Post podcast, available where you can download your podcasts. And it is a great honor to welcome to the show, Samantha Lewis.
Hi, fellas. Thank you so much for having me. My God, you've done your research, huh? I'm really impressed.
We're trying. We do what we can over here.
We're a part-time journalistic enterprise ourselves, so,
That's how it starts. That's how women's football journalism starts.
Let's go. I mean, we definitely caught the bug for sure. Well, Samantha, welcome to the show. Like Grant said, we're super excited to have you. We want to talk Australia, the team, the prospects, what the expectations are going to the Olympics. It's really creeping up here. We're just a few weeks out, starting to get really excited. Most of the countries have announced their squads. So I just want to kind of get right into it. 12th ranked team, according to FIFA. This is a team coming off a third place finish, 2023 World Cup. I'm sorry. This is a team coming off a fourth place finish, 2023 World Cup. What are the vibes like? You're on the ground. What are the conversations like with regard to how people are talking about this team, what they're expecting of this team?
People in Australia are obsessed with the Matildas. The Women's World Cup last year was a complete game changer here. I know so many people who had never watched women's soccer before who are now fanatic fans of this team. They buy the merchandise. One of them has got a tattoo. Like, there's a whole wave of new fans who have come to this team because of particularly the last 12 to 18 months. And it's a really exciting time, I think, to be getting around the Matildas. You know, as you said, they finished fourth at the Home World Cup, which was an amazing achievement. It's the furthest that a host nation has ever gone before in the tournament, aside from the USA. And to have done it at a sort of a turning point globally for women's sport was just perfect. Like, it was exactly the timing that they needed to go on that kind of run. And so I think because of that, and because of their fourth place finished at the Tokyo Olympics back in 2021, there's a real sense of optimism around this generation of Matildas that they can actually be the first Australian side to win a medal at the football tournament of an Olympic Games, because they've come so close in the last two major global tournaments that they've competed in. So at the moment, the vibes from the general public are really positive. There are lots of people who are really hoping and sort of expecting Australia to go quite deep in this tournament. But I have to qualify that by saying that those of us who have been covering the Matildas for a long time and who pay much closer attention to the global women's game are a little bit more reserved in what our expectations are of this squad, particularly in the absence of Sam Kerr. Because when we look back at the last Olympic Games, Sam Kerr was absolutely crucial to Australia getting as far as they did. She scored majority of the team's goals. She was the large reason that they got through those knockout games in the first place. And we haven't been able to find a proper replacement for her. We've got Michelle Heyman, who has been a sort of veteran striker who's been recalled to the team in the absence of a more natural number 9, but we don't have a lot of depth in that position. And my worry that I am now really starting to reckon with is that we are not going to be able to substantially fill that hole we've had a couple of players who have stepped up in the last 12 months in particular, during the Women's World Cup, for example, when Kerr was out with that calf injury. We had Caitlin Ford really come to the fore and pull Australia through a lot of those moments. We had Mary Fowler coming in. We had Hayley Rasso stepping up. So we did have a couple of players who were able to improvise and sort of fill the gap when it was required. So we kind of know what the Matildas look like without Sam Kerr. But I think now the issue is that other countries also know what we look like without Sam Kerr, and they've had much more time to prepare for what we are going to be without her. So that's a very rambly answer, but based on all of that, yeah, I think the expectations are mixed back here for how far the Matildas can go. And, this is going to be the last time that I think some of these key players make an appearance at an Olympic Games. Some of them have already flagged that they're going to be retiring. So there's a lot on the line. There's a lot at stake for some of these folks. And I think the hope, as it always is with the Matildas, the hope far exceeds, I think, the reality maybe of what they're capable of doing.
So if we had to put a place on it, you think about these expectations, and of course, understanding there is a range. If you had to put on full punditry hat and say, what is this team's ceiling? What do you think that is?
Right now, this generation of Matildas, I think the ceiling is a bronze medal. If they were to be able to get a silver or a gold medal, a second or a first place in any major tournament, it would be extraordinary. But I think what they've demonstrated in the past couple of years is that on their day, they really are capable of beating some of the best teams in the world. But whether they're capable of being the best team in the world is a separate question. And I don't think that they are quite ready to be that yet. I think they still lack the depth. I think they still lack the big tournament experience, if you can say that, in order to be consistently successful in the way that a Spain or an England or a Germany or a USA have been successful. So coming into the Paris Olympics, I think a lot of people are expecting that the Matildas at least reach the knockout stages, that they at least get through their group. And perhaps a par for the course will be getting to the final four based on their past results. But given the circumstances of their group, and given that this is just a 12-team tournament with some of the best teams in the whole world, and we are ranked 12, it's in that context, it will be surprising if we actually get as far as that.
Makes a lot of sense. I want to rewind just for a moment back to the 2023 World Cup, because obviously Sam Kerr sort of loomed over most of it. And then she does make a dramatic entrance, I think, much later in the tournament, scored an absolute banger. Maybe we'll talk about that later. We'll see if we have a little time for it. But with regard to this team, who would you say is the player that kind of holds the key in their hand? Who's the X factor?
Oh, that's a great question. I think the X factor is going to be Caitlin Ford. Caitlin Ford has been so important for Australia in the last 2 years. And, her move to Arsenal really was sort of the saving grace for the Matildas in a lot of ways, because she has come such a long way in her individual development, in her technical skills, in her speed, in her decision-making. Even now, you watch her come up against defenders and she plays with such swagger and such confidence that she really didn't used to have back in the day. And defenders still can't really figure her out. She's just too quick and she knows exactly what she wants to do all the time. So I think her as an individual, as we saw during the Women's World Cup, she can create such a difference in a moment. She is a big moment kind of player. She knows what to do in a moment. And I think the other really important thing about Caitlin Ford that maybe a lot of new fans don't know is she's actually very versatile. When she first started in the Matildas, she was a 15-year-old right back, and she was able to keep Marta from Brazil in her pocket during, I think it was the Olympic Games or maybe the Women's World Cup. I can't remember which one, but she was terrific as a young defender back then. Then she was sort of moved into a centre forward position. She's been moved onto the wing. Her and Sam Kerr, who'd been playing together for a very, very long time, often would switch in and out of each other's positions, both for club and for country. So she's capable of playing all along the front three, as well as dropping in a little bit deeper as well. And in an Olympic tournament, which has just an 18-player roster, You got back-to-back games in a really tight window. Having players who are both technically excellent and very, very good at their specific position, but also are very good at other people's positions is a real gem of a player to have. So, yeah, I think Caitlin Ford will be really crucial for the Matildas' chances, not just in scoring goals, but also in trying to sort of manage games and see them through to the very end, because it could just be one goal that sees us dumped out of the group stage compared to getting through to the knockouts, as what happened in Tokyo, or I think maybe it was Rio, where the Matildas only got through based on a +1 goal difference. So it really can come down to something as simple as that, and I think Caitlin Ford will be crucial.
That makes a lot of sense. Dino and I have talked a lot about it with the U.S. women's national team roster, especially, and I just totally agree with you, when you only have 18 players on that roster, versatility has to come into play when the manager is selecting those players. And for anybody who's interested, I mentioned the Far Post podcast. Sam and her colleagues talked about that. I believe that podcast is titled "Tillies in Paris." That episode of the Far Post. I used my context clues to determine. I think Tillies, is that short for Matildas?
Sure is.
Okay, nailed it. So yeah, everybody go listen to that podcast. It was very informative. So I want to kind of follow up on what Dino's saying there. We talk about that versatility. You guys have a lot of like good young talent on this team. Is there potential for a breakout star in these Olympic Games for the Australian side?
Yeah, we do have a couple of really impressive young players, but the annoying thing is that they're kind of stars already. If you'd asked me this question maybe 18 months ago, I would have said Mary Fowler. I think that she would absolutely be the breakout star, but she beat me to the punch with the World Cup and really put her name up in lights. And obviously she's kicked on with Manchester City as well and has become a really key cog in that machine. So Mary Fowler, I mean, I think that she still has so much room to grow. As fantastic as she already is, yeah, she's only 20 years old, and she's playing like she's been playing at this level for a decade. She's also someone who I think is really valuable for the Matildas and is a potential game changer along with Caitlin Ford. But what's really curious at the moment about Mary Fowler's position in the Matildas is that Tony Gustafsson, the head coach, hasn't quite found the best position to play her in because she's sort of too good at everything. She can be everywhere. And what we've seen, particularly over the past sort of 6 to 8 months after the Women's World Cup, is that while Mary had been played largely kind of as a central attacking midfielder during the tournament, recently she's been moved a little bit further out wide on the left and sort of played as an in-swinging kind of winger. Sometimes she moves to the right side of the field. She's kind of just got this really random roaming freedom to be able to do what she wants. And of course, you would encourage that for a player as creative and as technically gifted as Mary. But at the same time, the consequence of that is that you can never really quite find her best spot because she's kind of doing everything. And therefore, it's really difficult, I think, to build a team around her because she can be everywhere all the time. So how do you build a consistent structure and consistent chemistry with particular teammates when you're here, there, and everywhere? And we haven't really seen, I think, by virtue of that, the best of Mary Fowler so far. So I'm going to be really interested to watch what Gustafsson does with Fowler during the Olympics because she is so pivotal to the way that the Matildas play. And yet she's one of those players who, when she doesn't have a great game, she really goes missing completely. Where there are some players who are great, but if they have a bad game, they still do something. But Mary Fowler can really go missing sometimes. And I think that's what perhaps she needs to work on a bit more as a player, is ensuring that she has an impact in every game that she's in. Even if it's not her best game, that she still manages to do something. So Fowler would be my hypothetical breakout star if she wasn't already a superstar. Same as Kyra Cooney-Cross, another fantastic player who had a really great Women's World Cup and has signed for Arsenal. She's not really getting that much game time over there, but I think a lot of people still realize her qualities. Yeah, I mean, those are kind of the two players that I can really pick because of the limited squad size. Sadly, we had a couple of young players who were chosen as the substitutes or the reserve players instead of in the final the 18-player squad. But if anyone from the IOC is listening to this, please expand the squad to 23 so I can talk more about young players.
For sure, and just for player health and safety too, I think 23 seems like a more reasonable number.
Absolutely. Yeah. If there are any major knee injuries that happen during this Olympic Games, I think the entire women's soccer community globally is going to be sending some very angry emails and tweets to the IOC.
I'd imagine.
Wow. Yeah, not something I'd considered, but yeah, that's definitely happening. So let's hope for that to not happen, hopefully. Fingers
Touching
crossed.
all the wood in my house.
Absolutely. I'll do the same over here in Orlando. Quick question about the World Cup again, because I just found it fascinating. Obviously, the Matildas, they're playing at home. What I thought was extremely interesting was a lot of different types of results. France, it's a 0-0. They go to PKs. They blow Canada out in the last group stage match. They sort of squeaked by Ireland in the opener, where there was a lot of tension, like a lot of energy in the building that you can feel handled their business at Denver. There was a lot of different variants with regard to the style of play, the formula, the recipe. Are the Matildas a squad that maybe kind of have every identity and like also no identity, or style-wise, what are you expecting here?
The style question is a really big one, isn't it? Because the Matildas have kind of ebbed and flowed in terms of their styles and their systems over the years. And it's really depended on the squad and the players that are at the disposal of the coach at the time. And the interesting thing about when Tony Gustafsson came in is that one of the things that he really wanted to understand was kind of the spirit of the Matildas and how they saw themselves. And one of the things that has made the Matildas what they are sort of culturally is this never say die, quote unquote, attitude, such that it was literally stitched into the jerseys that they wore for the 2019 Women's World Cup. And so that's kind of become their sort of spiritual motto, I suppose you could say. And this could be a good thing or a bad thing, but that's kind of how they play too. The anxiety-inducing thing about being a Matildas fan is that they are just as likely to barrel their way to a fourth-placed finish as they are to tumble out of a group stage. Those two possibilities are equally likely by playing the same football, because they are a very on the edge kind of rock and roll, high energy, risk-taking side. And they have had in the past the players to be able to justify that and to make it kind of look like it's part of the plan. And Sam Kerr, I think in particular, has been really crucial to that, because she has such sort of supernatural abilities that she's been able to create something from nothing or something from half nothings. And that's where her absence sort of starts to become a bit more intriguing, is that can the Matildas still play in this kind of style where they can sacrifice so much and risk so much, but have absolutely zero reward for it, and potentially even suffer the consequences of that by leaving themselves too open to the opposition if they don't have someone as good as Sam Kerr who's there and able to tie a neat little bow around all of those chances. So it's a really curious one. And Gustafsson, over his sort of 4-year tenure, has shapeshifted somewhat in the system and style that the Matildas have been playing. Partly that's due to the different opponents that they have come up against. Coming up against an Asian opponent who tends to park the bus and sit and defend really deep requires a different kind of football from the Matildas than, say, a France or a USA, who are much more aggressive, much more attacking, and are going to have probably much more of the ball than what Australia will. But the great thing, and the thing that I am really grateful for about Gustafsson, is that he has come in and he has actually allowed the players themselves to learn to do all these different things. Whereas historically, they really have kind of been a one-track team. A lot of it has been sort of direct, long balls to whoever is up front and hoping that they're fast and strong and good enough to be able to score goals. Whereas they've come up against tactically more sophisticated sides, or sides that have really challenged them in fundamental ways, and they haven't been able to find the answers to that. Whereas particularly in the last 2 years, I think the Matildas have really evolved in that sense. And so they can play a number of different systems against a number of different kinds of opponents. They can play, as we saw against Denmark during the World Cup, counter-attacking football. They can play possession football that they played against Canada. They can do lots of different things now, and they're equally confident and equally capable of doing all of that. So while, yes, that does mean that maybe they don't have a sort of consistent style in the way that you would say a USA does or a Spain does, they are more multifaceted in the way that they play their football now. And I think in the global game, considering how many different systems and styles there are, I personally would prefer a team who is able to do all of it, as opposed to a team who is just very good at one of those things.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. I think that is also the mark of a good manager, to say, hey, you guys can be yourselves. I want you to express yourselves out there on the pitch but also let's pick and choose the way we're doing that in these different scenarios. And if you're not quite as deep as a team like Spain or France, having that ability to kind of adjust your style of play is a benefit when you might be a little outgunned talent-wise. But to think about a player on the Tillies, which I'd like to start using if I may.
Please do.
A player on the Tillies who does not ever look outgunned out there. Dino and I covered the Women's Champions League. It was really the genesis of us starting this podcast, how closely we were watching it. I wrote in my notes several times, and now I finally have a journalist from Australia to ask this very serious question. Is Ellie Carpenter the fastest person in the world?
I would like to say yes. She certainly looks like she's the fastest person in the world when she runs, because she has that extraordinary, like, white hot hair blazing out behind her, right? And she looks like she could run through walls if you put one in front of her, because her momentum just takes her through another galaxy. But when it comes to actual speed on the Matildas, I have no data to back this up, but just based on the eye test, I would have to say that either Hayley Raso or Courtney Vine are probably faster than Ellie Carpenter from a sort of a standing start and a quick, like, 100-meter sprint. I mean, I would love to line all three of them up and really test this, but I think the Matildas staff might kill me, so I'm probably not going to do that. But I would say that those three players in particular are the fastest players, not necessarily just in the Matildas, but potentially even in world football. And what I kind of love is that all three of them play on the same side of the field when they're out there as well. You've got your Ellie Carpenter and your Hayley Raso, who are usually interchanging on the right, and then you've got basically a like-for-like substitution with Hayley Raso and Courtney Vine coming on, as well as that really quick winger who can get in behind. And that's another great, back to the earlier point about the style of the Matildas, I think that's another really important element of that is speed. And that's something that Gustafsson has really hammered home with the players as well, is speed, not just physically speed, but speed of decision making and how quickly we can adjust ourselves as a unit on the field to be able to solve tactical problems. And that's something that the Matildas have really, really evolved in over the last couple of years, which has been fabulous to see. And it's really nice as well seeing that speedy players can still be valuable. You know, we had sort of a period where we were like, no, it's not just about being fast anymore. It's about tactics. It's about being slow and methodical and smart about football. It's like, no, you can still be fast and smart at football, and that actually makes you even better. So let's leave a bit more room for the speedy gals, all right?
Yeah, and there's definitely a lot of speed on that roster. We've talked about the stacked field. The Matildas group specifically, Australia shares a group with the USA, Germany, and Zambia, who's not to be slept on either. Are there any areas where the Matildas will have an advantage, in your opinion? Have you thought about a pathway, or what the recipe looks like, considering the other three teams in that group?
Look, I would like to comfort myself by saying that we are in the group of death, but I think every group in this Olympics is a group of death. So I can't really lean back on that argument to make myself feel better. Look, Germany, the USA, and Zambia are three unbelievable teams, and they have so many different kinds of weapons at their disposal that the Matildas are really going to have to try very, very hard to counter. You know, we've got the USA, who under Emma Hayes are looking absolutely frightening, especially now that you've got Sophia Smith and Trinity Rodman and Jaden Shaw and, you know, a couple of young, really exciting, dynamic, interesting players who are finally sort of clicking with each other. I think the weakness in the USA is potentially in midfield, personally, and that is where I think maybe Australia have a little bit of an edge over them, especially if Katrina Gorry is fit and firing, if she's able to come back from this ankle surgery that she had a couple of months ago, and she's at the same level that she was during the Women's World Cup, combined with Kyra Cooney-Cross and potentially Mary Fowler in there as well. I think we have a really excellent midfield who have a lot of dimension to them and a lot of ways of being able to not just suffocate an opposition midfield, but to be able to scythe through them and find avenues towards goal through that. I think with Germany, I mean, they obviously had a pretty terrible Women's World Cup, and that makes me a little bit more worried about them, actually, because they're going to be coming into this Olympics with revenge on their mind and wanting to make up for that pretty crap tournament as well. And they're obviously a very physical team. They're very good in the air. Technically, in terms of their possession, they're very good. They're very smart. They've also got a very good midfield as well. Lena Oberndorf, I think, is one of the greatest players in football at the moment. Yeah, she wasn't at the Women's World Cup, but I think she's going to be pretty excited for this Olympics too. So in that respect, I think the way that the Matildas ought to attack that is by really emphasising their wing play and their wide play, and talking about the speed and stuff earlier, you know, having those wide plays in your Caitlin Ford and your Hayley Rasso, your overlaps with Ellie Carpenter and Steph Catley in particular on the left, another absolutely unbelievable player who nobody gives enough credit to, forcing Germany to be pulled apart, and then having some players bombing in through the middle, those midfielders, and Michelle Heyman, who's very good in the air. That seems to me to be the biggest strength for the Matildas in that particular game. And Zambia, I mean, Zambia are kind of being framed here as the weakest team in the group, but they have two of the best centre forwards currently operating in world football. And if the Matildas are known for anything, it's being a little bit shaky at the back. So I am a little bit scared of what is going to happen in that Zambia game. Barbara Manda and Rachel Kudananji have just been sensational in the NWSL since they moved there. They're playing consistently against world-class centre-backs, and they are just like slicing through them like a knife through butter. It's really, really scary. Whereas we've sort of got a centre-back pairing in Alana Kennedy and Claire Hunt, who they haven't really had a huge amount of game time together. Claire Hunt only debuted for the Matildas less than a year ago, and she's obviously excellent and has really risen up the ranks and signed for PSG. But she's also been out with an injury over the last few months and has only recently been reincorporated back into the side alongside Kennedy, who herself is kind of prone to a clanger every now and then, as we saw during the Women's World Cup when we lost to Nigeria. So the worry there is that Australia will really underestimate Zambia in the same way that they did Nigeria. Perhaps they'll get through that first game against Germany and think that it's smooth sailing, but that's when you let your guard down, and then that's when you're most vulnerable. So yeah, I mean, against that kind of opponent, I think it really will be just about neutralizing those two attackers and just trying to find alternative ways to goal. Because there's obviously Zambia, not just those two players. They have a very good team. That's why they're in the Olympics. But leaning into the things that make the Matildas deadly, which is defending really well and then counter-attacking at speed, I think that'll be the way to defeat Zambia.
Yeah, we've had multiple discussions. Dino has a front row seat for Barbara Banda in Orlando. She came up to Seattle and scored 2 goals in a game that she didn't even look as effective as she does usually, and she still got a brace against the Seattle Reign up here.
I know, she's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, she's unbelievable. I'll be really interested to see how other teams, I think you almost have to try to play possession football and just play keep away from Banda and Kudananji if you really want to try to neutralize them. Dino, since you took that question, I want to take another one of the fun questions. This is one we also posited near the beginning of the Champions League. I believe Sam Kerr stands roughly 5'7". I think she's either 5'7" or 5'8", where she's listed. Assuming complete health, the knees feeling great, the ability to get an athletic run-up, do you think Sam Kerr could dunk a basketball?
Yes. I think she can.
Let's
not just
go.
because she, like, athletically, she is so gifted, and like we've seen how fantastic she is in the air, but also her background is in a sport called Aussie Rules. I don't know if Americans know about Aussie Rules. The shorthand for it over here is AFL, and AFL is kind of like if you combine basketball with soccer, and it requires a lot of jumping, a lot of athleticism, and this was Sam Kerr's sport up until she was about 13, 14, and then she had to pick basically which one she wanted to pursue, and she chose football. So she's got a background in Aussie Rules, so she knows how to throw herself up into the air, and she's also a huge basketball fan, so I wouldn't be shocked if, like, in her downtime she goes and throws a couple hoops as well. So that's another thing that I want to ask the Matilda staff to do. Give me a proper Olympic height basketball ring and let me see whether Sam Kerr can do this and film it, because the content would be immaculate.
I love it. It's like some combination of like a middle school field day, and we used to have a show here in the 80s and 90s called American Gladiators, where like it's just like some combination of random track and field and events that we could start to get a handle on the true athletic ability. Well, you heard it here first. Your boys posited it. Sam Kerr can definitely dunk a basketball. Now we've got confirmation from the one and only Samantha Lewis. We appreciate that. You mentioned Australia might be sitting in the group of death. Here on the ITC, we refer to that as the group of life. The original group of life was during the Champions League, where we had PSG, Ajax, Bayern, and Roma flip-flopping for the duration of the group stage. I think this group, Zambia, US, Germany, Australia, probably qualifies as this tournament's group of life. So we can feel free to embrace that terminology, which we just kind of get a kick out of here at the ITC.
Love that. I'll take that. It'll help me quell my anxieties about it.
We're embracing the fear full on. I think it's mutual worldwide. So Samantha, you've been very generous with your time. We appreciate your insight, your expertise. Can you tell our folks, by the way, real quick note before we ask them to check out some of your work, on X, I believe, and we've had Leanne Sanderson on the show. We've had Cameron Pope and Chris Sharples from the DAZN Network. We've had our pal Asil Tufaili, former Lebanon national team player, now journalist for Forbes. Samantha, I do believe you also hold the distinction best Twitter handle in the history of Into the Channel guests. Where can our pals who watch the show find you on Twitter?
This is so embarrassing. And you know what's really even more embarrassing is that when I came up with this Twitter handle, I was, I think, 17 or 18. Yes. And I just thought it was a fun little thing that wouldn't mean anything to anybody. But now I'm kind of too far deep that I can't change it because this is how people know me now. So my Twitter handle is Battle Dinosaur. I remember talking to a friend of mine who knew someone at Twitter because she sort of came to me and said, "Are you interested in changing your Twitter handle to your name, something that's a little bit more professional, a little bit more official?" And I was like, well, but do people know my name anymore? I think people probably just know me as Battle Dinosaur. So yeah, that is sadly how I'm known now around the world.
Okay. I mean, I will disagree only in the sense that I don't think it's sadly at all. I think it's fantastic. I will say it did make me double take. I was like, when I was doing the research to invite you on, I was like, same person? Okay, yes, this is the good reporting. These are the right links. Okay, this is what I want. And so speaking of that good reporting, you had a couple of just wonderful articles. Dino alluded to it earlier. You recently published a couple great articles for ABC. I'm hoping you could share those with the audience and point them in that direction.
Yeah, so I have a particular fondness for writing about the history of Australian women's soccer. During the Women's World Cup last year, one of my biggest passions was using the platform and the spotlight of the tournament to be able to educate a lot of folks about the fact that our game has a much longer history and much more interesting history than I think what most people realise, going back over 100 years. So I was very fortunate to be able to tell a lot of really interesting stories about some pioneer players, some pioneer teams, and some pioneer tournaments that no one had really heard of before. And one of those teams was a club side based here in Sydney called St. George Budapest. And they were one of the first women's teams that were founded in Australia back in the very late 1960s and early 1970s. And that club became really famous, not just because they were incredibly successful on the field, going for 10 years undefeated, but because the vast majority of those players were also the first to represent Australia in an international tournament overseas. So in 1975, Hong Kong hosted what has now become known as the first ever Women's Asian Cup. It was organised by the Asian Ladies Football Confederation because back then it was ladies' governance and men's governance. It wasn't the same. And it was the same here in Australia as well. Women's soccer was organised by the Australian Women's Soccer Association, whereas the men's game was governed by the Australian Soccer Federation, which was just for men. So in 1975, the Australian Women's Soccer Association received an invitation from the organisers of this tournament in Hong Kong to send a team to come over and represent Australia in this tournament. It was very rudimentary, I suppose. There were just 5 teams that were there. And because the Australian Women's Soccer Association had never had a national team before for women, they, through one of their executive members, the secretary of the AWSA, a woman named Pat O'Connor, she played for St. George Budapest. She was the captain. And her husband, Joe, was the coach. So through her, they nominated St. George Budapest, basically, in addition to 2 other players from another club nearby in Sydney, to go over to Hong Kong and be the Australian representative for this tournament. They finished third. It was great. There were tens of thousands of spectators there, which is amazing for the mid-70s.
Yeah.
There were a number of goals that were scored. It was all a really impressive and historic moment for Australian women's football. But the problem is that that team has never been formally recognised as the first official Matildas team, because in the process of that team being put together, there was no formal selection process that was organised. It was just a club team that went over and happened to wear Australian shirts and had an Australian sign before they played. So they just happened to be an Australian representative. They weren't an actual national team of Australia because they didn't go through this formal selection process run by the governing body. However, the issue is that the players who represented Australia at that tournament disagree. They think that they should be recognised as the first official Matildas team because they effectively were. They were the Australian national team of the time at the absence of an actual national team. And so they feel that they deserve the same recognition and the same accolades and the same place in history as what every other national team who came afterwards have received. And this has been a real point of tension for the alumni of the Matildas, which now exceeds over 200 different players, because the vast majority of them don't think that this 1975 team deserved to be recognised as officially capped Matildas because they weren't selected as such. They didn't go through a selection process in the same way that all the other teams and all the other players from 1978, which is the first recognised Matildas team, have done. So there's been this real rift that has opened up in the alumni of the Matildas about this question. And in 2022, Football Australia, who's the current governing body of the men's and the women's game, they compiled a panel of historians to try and really figure out and justify a particular position on this question, because they were getting more and more complaints and concerns about it. And that panel of historians in 2022 concluded that the 1975 team was not a national team because it did not go through this selection process. And a lot of us thought that the issue was done, that it was put to bed, that everyone would just move on with their lives. But the 1975ers, as they've become known, weren't satisfied. Even though Football Australia had welcomed them into the football family and wanted to acknowledge them in a particular way, the players declined, and they said that they wouldn't settle until they had official caps and were formally recognised as Matildas. So this week, Football Australia announced that they would reverse their decision and that the 1975ers are now going to be formally recognised as Matildas. This came after a separate review into the original 2022 decision was made. The panel of historians that were consulted in that original decision were not consulted at all for this one. Football Australia reached out to 4 international experts, quote unquote, to put together a new series of criteria for basically what qualifies a team to be a national team. And so they overrode all the work that had already been done by their own experts, and they concluded that yes, this 1975 team ticked enough boxes that they should be considered a formal team. And as predicted, it has set the entire Matildas alumni on fire. There have been a lot of complaints and frustrations that I've heard from players who are really saddened by what's happened, including who used to be the first captain and cap number 1 of the Matildas, Julie Dolan, who, you know, she had her photo beamed up on the sails of the Sydney Opera House when we won the rights to co-host the Women's World Cup. You know, she's a really significant figure in our game. Her name is used for the medal that's awarded to the most valuable player in the A-League Women domestic club competition here as well. So, like, she's a really important person. And now the thing that has made her important has been stripped away from her by some people who probably don't know very much about women's soccer in Australia in the first place. So the process behind it is one of the biggest concerns for me. The fact that our own historians were totally ignored in favour of these people overseas, including the former head of communications of Canada Soccer. Like, they were just kind of really random, and we were never given any justification for why these people were selected or what expertise they had to weigh into this conversation. And the historians that knew for decades so much about the game here, they weren't even asked to review this decision by these new people. They were just told that this is the new decision, and that's it. They had no opportunity to respond to that. So some of the historians, or a lot of the historians that I know in Australian soccer, are incredibly angry that this was the process that was done after they thought that they'd arrived at a really justified and sound historical position about this question. And now it's thrown open this can of worms in so many other respects, because the new criteria is very different to the original way in which we measured or qualified people to be national team players. So now there is potentially a huge group of people, including players who only ever sat on the bench for both the Matildas and the Socceroos, the men's national team, and players who were in B squads, so not A internationals, but B teams, so reserve teams. All of them now have a case for prosecuting why they should be recognised as capped players, whereas before in the old criteria, they weren't able to. So I don't really think Football Australia realise what they've done in this respect. I don't think they understand the Pandora's box that they've opened and the huge number of loose ends that are still untied and haven't been accounted for. So yeah, it's a really it folds in a lot of really interesting threads about the history of the Australian game, about governance decisions, about the legacy of national teams, about the community and the culture of the alumni. Lots of things that I'm really interested in personally and also professionally as my job. But it's also just very it's very sad at the end of the day, because we're barely 12 months on from hosting a Women's World Cup, which was this extraordinary unifying moment for the game and for our country. And now this decision has been made, which has caused a massive fracture in the very same community that were meant to benefit from that tournament. So ultimately, it's just, it really leaves you flat.
A lot of twists and turns. I appreciate you sharing the story with us. And I feel like the phrase, I don't think insert federation here knows exactly what they've done, that feels like a universal truth across the globe.
Yep, absolutely. Yeah, and it's kind of the story of the history of the game here as well. Any Australians who are listening to this podcast will know exactly what I'm talking about, that we are undefeated when it comes to shooting ourselves in the foot as a sport. Whenever we've got a good thing, we find a way to ruin it. And this seems to be just the latest example of that.
Understandable. So the other story I had referenced is about Courtney Vine, who you had referenced earlier in this show. And now I can't decide if I'm asking you to rehash other things that are maybe not great for Australian football. But at the risk of opening that door, I know obviously we're based here in the States. People were excited to see Courtney Vine signing with the North Carolina Courage. You wrote about some additional implications to that signing.
Yeah, so Courtney Vine is a really interesting story, and I think she's very emblematic of the state that the A-League women is currently in. A lot of us were surprised when she re-signed for Sydney FC, her hometown club, after the Women's World Cup, after she shot to fame for scoring that iconic penalty against France. So she re-signed for Sydney for a year. And Sydney was the club which really was her breakout club. I mean, she'd played for a couple of other clubs in the past, but Sydney was where she really came into her own. It was where she got her Matildas call-ups, and it's where she ultimately has become a legend of Australian sport. So when she re-signed for them, for personal reasons, I think it was potentially that she felt she owed them perhaps some of her success in that way. Her partner, Charlotte McLean, who has also joined the North Carolina Courage, was playing for Sydney at the time too. Obviously, she had friends and family here. She loves living in Australia. But I think also the Australian Professional Leagues, which is the governing body that runs the A-Leagues, the men's and the women's comp, they probably saw Courtney Vine as their biggest marketing tool at the time, because the whole country knew who she was. She'd just been part of this incredible moment with the Matildas during the World Cup. Her face was everywhere. So it wouldn't have surprised me if they threw a lot of money at her to be sort of a marquee marketing guru player, to be the player who would do all the signings and all the photo shoots and be across all the promotional material for the league, because that was their goal, right? They needed to capitalize on the halo effect of this Women's World Cup and try to translate that interest into interest in the A-League women, the domestic club comp, which has always kind of struggled to bank on the success of the Matildas. So Courtney Vine was kind of perfect. She was exactly the person that they needed. And it worked. You know, the first game that Courtney Vine played, which was the opening game between Sydney FC and the Western Sydney Wanderers, so the Sydney Derby, it set a new record for attendance figures in the competition throughout history. It was over 11,000 people who turned out for that opening game. Nice. and it still hasn't been broken. So, it did work in that respect. And any game that you went to involving Sydney FC where Courtney Vine was playing, you would see fans lining up all the way around the field, regardless of which club they supported, in order to get a signature or a photo with Courtney Vine. So she was fantastic in that respect. And obviously she's a great player. She was probably already too good for this league. And I don't think anyone is shocked that now is the time for her to make this move overseas. But the issue I think that the A-League women are now going to have is that increasingly they are losing these players. They are losing these big name star players who have Matildas caps. They have recognition because the A-League women here is still not full-time. It's still not fully professional. It's part-time. Players are still paid basically the minimum that they can be paid. And it's just not competitive enough, especially for players who are seeking bigger and better things from the national team, like Courtney Vine. So increasingly, we're seeing our best and brightest players move elsewhere, going overseas in seeking full-time football. And it's been a real bugbear of mine personally, because this is the second kind of wave that we've experienced of this particular thing. The first wave was back in sort of 2019-20, when your Sam Kerrs and your Caitlin Fords and your Alana Kennedys and your Steph Catleys made that first move over to Europe to sign for these big clubs. That should have been the canary in the coal mine for the people who run the leagues, that they needed to do something and do something quickly. They needed to find more money. They needed to expand the competition. They needed to make it full-time because these players want to be full-time athletes. And if you can't offer them a competition that does that, then they're not going to stay. Like, it's a pretty simple equation. But we're 4 years down the track now, and it still hasn't happened. So it's really frustrating for those of us who have watched this and who care so much about the women's game and who see what's happening overseas. The NWSL is the perfect example how rapidly that has grown in popularity, in investment, in success, in competitiveness over the past, not just 4 years, but even the last 2 years, really. The expansion of the clubs, all these new fan bases coming in, like, you've just got the perfect mix of things that is working so well for your market. And here in Australia, the people who are governing our game just don't seem to understand that. And I think one of the biggest problems is that because the women's clubs are still deeply financially tied to the men's clubs, those in decision-making positions will always prioritize the men. They will always fund men more. They will always think of them first when it comes to marketing. They will always think of them first when it comes to scheduling. They will always put them first. And the women just have to deal with whatever is left over. And for me and for an increasing number of people, it's starting to get to the point where we're talking about maybe separating these two competitions and trying to have an independently run A-League women, very similar to what the NWSL does, because that really is kind of the standard that I think a lot of people are looking to. Yes, the WSL in England is great, but it's also suffering at the same time from this same issue that we've got, which is that they're too tied to their men's teams and too dependent on them, and they can't really separate and spin off and become their own entity. So that's where this competition sort of sits at the moment. And my real worry is that in the wake of this Women's World Cup, which was meant to be this sort of new foundational moment for the women's game in Australia, that those who have the strategic decision-making positions in the sport, and particularly in the league, have made the wrong decisions, or they're making decisions too slowly. And so all of the organic, natural momentum and excitement and energy that the World Cup generated is just going to trickle away. And there's not going to be much of a league left over for people to get excited about.
Totally agree. I think it is the most massive advantage that the NWSL has, is that they are not tied to other clubs. They have independent investors. I mean, I'm saying that as a Seattle Reign supporter. The group that owns the Seattle Sounders just bought the Seattle Reign from OL Group. And some people are happy about the investment. I'm happy that now they can maybe get active in the transfer window. But there is that part in the back of my mind that goes, okay, don't start treating the club like second class. You see it happening in Manchester United. There's that absolutely ridiculous story where they're shuffling everybody around. They're shuffling the women out of their facility to make room for the men. Just shameful behavior by United.
Well, imagine where there's relegation in the Premier League too. So you have a bottom three team. Now they're down in the championship, cost them tens of millions of dollars probably. And now a women's team has to suffer because of that. We really just kind of need to have this be decoupled. Zambia is another nation where there's huge issues with regard to investment. And then you realize, of course, there's one body that's divvying up the money, and there's a men's team and a women's team. And all the while, Samantha, you mentioned Vonda, Kunanaji, Chanda. Like, this is a team with superstars, like global superstars that have far outshone, the men's side. And they're still sort of having to contend with having to scrap for dollars that should absolutely be there. But yeah, again, just want to thank you for the time. Thank you for hopping on with us, going into the channel with us. We very, very much appreciate it. I think we've got a real great understanding of the Matildas and exactly what's at stake, not just on the pitch, but as an enterprise. So we very much appreciate you hopping on, giving us all the dirt, everything we need to know about the tournament, getting us excited.
Spilling all the tea about the history of this giant game. Yeah.
All the tea. Rewind back to the 70s. We're all about the never say die here. We're going to stitch that, on the inside of these bad boys as soon as we get off the call. So very much appreciate all of the all the background and the great intel. Thanks again for coming on.
Thank you so much. This was really, really fun. Yeah, no, any opportunity to come on and talk Tillies, whether old or new, is one that I relish. And yeah, I mean, fingers crossed for this Olympic Games as well. Both of our national teams are in this group of life together. I don't know how it's going to go, but hopefully we are able to remain friends at the end of it.
Absolutely.
Always,
no doubt.
Always.
We'll be checking at Battle Dinosaur for the updates from your side of the world. And for everybody watching, thanks for joining us. Make sure, again, you check out Samantha Lewis's work at abc.net.au. I just did a simple search of Samantha Lewis Women's Football Australia. That brought up a bunch of her work as well. So go find that. And for everybody, we will talk to you next time.